Welcome back, everyone. This is episode 40 of Why Christians Should Keep the Law. And today we are going to build upon what we looked at in our last message. If you remember, we brought, the Apostle Paul and the Apostle James to the table and looking at two very different statements that by some have been seen as being contrary to one another, contradicting one another. The Apostle Paul, he comes to the table and says, hey, you're justified by faith. And then you have James come to the table and says, well, man, it's justified by works. And it kind of leaves the reader asking the question, well, who's right? Who do I believe? Who's got the good theology? And the answer to that is both. They both have good theology. They're both right. They both have a very clear understanding of salvation and how that is obtained. They both understand what I would call the structure of the faith. That is, what is required of man is faith in Jesus and obedience to carry out that faith and the action of loving our God and loving our neighbor. Well, today I want to build upon that conversation. And I actually want to begin by showing you, interestingly enough, that long before Paul ever makes the statement that man is justified by faith, apart from the works of the law, he makes a very, very different statement before in chapter 2. It's a statement that literally is a mere reflection of what James says. So going back to Romans chapter 2, verse 13, listen to what Paul says. He says, not the hearers of the law are just in the sight of God. Listen to this. But the doers of the law will be justified. Who is going to be justified but those who do the law, who walk it out, who accomplish it, who submit to it, to its criteria, to the principles embedded within. This is literally what James said in chapter 2, verse 24, when he said, a man is justified by works of the law, not by faith only, but by works of the law. Literally what Paul has just come out and declared. Absolutely amazing. And so I want to spend some time today in chapter 2, because I really want to kind of build up to go back to chapter 3, verse 28, and we're going to dig in even further. And so, there's a lot that we need to glean from in regard to the Apostle Paul and his discourse, specifically in regard to that of the law. And so I want to push ahead here a little bit, and I want to pick it up in verse 25. The Apostle Paul makes the following statement. He says, for circumcision is indeed profitable if you keep the law. Now I want to stop because the Apostle Paul is actually addressing specifically here his Jewish brethren. And he's saying, yes, your circumcision that you have, that's commanded back in Genesis 17, yes, that's profitable only if you're actually observing the law. And then he goes on, but if you are a breaker of the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. Now, that's a pretty intense statement. If you understand the first century context, you understand what circumcision meant, what it meant to be Jewish is to be totally separate, totally separated from the Gentile. And then to come out and say, hey, if you're not keeping the law, then you're nothing but a pagan heathen. You're nothing but a Gentile. This is a very strong presentation, if you will. It's very strong language that would have hit much harder in the first century than what typically is picked up on today. Now he goes on and he says this, therefore, if an uncircumcised man keeps the righteous requirements of the law. Okay, so when he says an uncircumcised man, we're talking about Gentiles. And he says, if we keep the righteous requirements of the law, will not his uncircumcision be counted as circumcision. In other words, here you have this pagan, heathen Gentile that was totally separated and cast off from Israel. If they do the things that are in the law of God, if they walk them out, if they are obedient, if they keep them, their uncircumcision becomes circumcision. And circumcision matters because that is the call of inheritance. That's the evidence, if you will. Hey, you're a descendant of Abraham. This covenant that God made with Abraham, that very mark, the seal of the righteousness of the faith, has been placed in this person. And so to receive and to be called and classified as circumcised is an absolutely phenomenal statement. But then he continues and says this, and will not the physically uncircumcised, if he fulfills the law, judge you, who even with your written code in circumcision are a transgressor of the law. Again, if you put these words back in their historical context, and some may argue these be fighting words. The words like this would not go over well amongst the Jewish audience. But the reality remains that what Paul is saying is fundamentally true. And then he goes on, for he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision, that which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly. That is an amazing statement. Again, if you take this back into the first century, calling a Gentile a Jew on any level, that you know something radical has happened. And so he says he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart in the spirit, not in the letter, whose praise is not from men, but from God. And so the Apostle Paul talks about this glorious thing that takes place when Gentiles adhere to the godly principles that are embedded within the law, when they actually just do them. They naturally want to do them. It's in their heart to perform the love of God, and specifically that love of God for God himself and for their fellow neighbor. And I love how he articulates that the circumcision, it's not in the flesh, it's in the heart. It's in the spirit. And remember Jesus's words in John 7, where he says, everyone who believes in me, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. And this he spoke according to the Spirit, that those who would believe in him, they would receive. They would receive the Spirit of God. Everyone that would put their faith in Jesus, God would pour out his Spirit on them. And so it's not in the letter, which is to say, not in the letter, it's to go back to Genesis 17. And Genesis 17 requires everyone who is to be part of Abraham's household is to be circumcised. And yet, something incredible has taken place, where a circumcision is coming to the Gentiles, and it's not a circumcision by man, it's by God himself. And in that capacity, Paul articulates it as they become a Jew who is one inwardly, because they're receiving the promises that were given to Abraham. These are the promises of God, where they used to be an alien from that. They were a foreigner to the promises and covenants of the living God, but now they're partaking of the inheritance. Absolutely incredible. Well, stay tuned. We got more to go through in regard to Paul's epistle to the Romans. The Lord bless you and keep you.